The sun had barely risen when Daniel Rojas made his way to the stables. The morning air was cool and carried the scent of fresh hay and earth. He walked slowly, taking in the stillness of the ranch. The faint sounds of horses shifting in their stalls were the only noises breaking the silence. Daniel's fingers gently brushed against the leather straps hanging in the corner of the stable. He had worked with horses all his life, and they were more than animals to him. They were companions, each one with its own personality and needs. Today, however, something felt different. The usual calmness of the ranch was disrupted by the sharp sound of a truck arriving. Daniel glanced over his shoulder, catching sight of the sleek, black vehicle. It belonged to Don Esteban, the wealthy ranch owner who had long held Daniel in disdain. Daniel wasn't bothered by the man's cruelty. He had learned long ago that staying silent was the best way to survive here. The truck's engine roared as it came to a stop, dust rising from the gravel. Don Esteban stepped out, his boots kicking up dirt, his face stern and unreadable. Behind him, a young woman got out of the vehicle. She was dressed simply, unlike the glamorous women who usually visited the ranch. Her appearance caught Daniel's attention, but he quickly turned back to his work, focusing on preparing the horses for the day. Little did he know today would be unlike any other. The world around him was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. Elena Ferrer stepped onto the dusty ground, her shoes sinking slightly into the earth as she walked toward the stables. She glanced at her father, who was already barking orders at the workers, his voice echoing across the ranch. Elena felt the weight of his gaze on her. He had never been kind to her. His love was always conditional, measured by her obedience. She wasn't like the other women in her social circle. She didn't care for lavish parties or the shallow conversations about business deals. What she longed for was something simpler, something real. The ranch, with its quiet mornings and the natural beauty of the animals, always brought her a sense of peace she couldn't find in her father's world. As she entered the stable, the warmth of the horses greeted her. She ran her hand along the wooden beams, feeling a strange connection to the animals. They too were treated harshly by her father, but they had an air of freedom that she envied. Her eyes wandered over to Daniel, who was busy grooming one of the horses. There was something about the way he moved, his calm, steady presence, that caught her attention. Unlike the other workers, Daniel never seemed to rush or show fear. His quiet confidence intrigued her. Elena had heard whispers from the staff about his ability to connect with the horses, about how he could tame the wildest beasts with nothing but patience and respect. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to him. Daniel noticed her watching him, and for a moment their eyes met. He looked away quickly, a faint blush rising to his cheeks. Elena smiled softly, but before she could say anything, her father's voice cut through the air. "Elena, come here. Don't waste time with these people." Elena hesitated, then turned away from Daniel, but something in her chest tightened. She didn't want to leave this place, she didn't want to go back to her father's world. The morning continued with the usual routine, but the atmosphere had shifted. Elena couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. The ranch felt different today, tense like the calm before a storm. Daniel went about his work as always with quiet precision. He moved from horse to horse, making sure each one was ready for the day ahead. His focus was unwavering, his mind locked on the task at hand, but he couldn't ignore the strange pull he felt whenever Elena was nearby. He had seen her many times before, always in passing, always from a distance. But today something about her presence stirred something in him. There was a sadness in her eyes, a yearning for something more than the life her father had forced upon her. He knew that feeling all too well. As he led one of the horses out of the stable, the sound of hooves pounding against the ground suddenly shattered the quiet morning. A wild neigh echoed through the ranch, followed by the sound of horses in distress. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He rushed toward the noise, his instincts kicking in. The horses were agitated, their eyes wide with fear. And in the middle of it all stood Centauro, the most dangerous horse in the ranch. Centauro was a wild, black stallion, bred for strength and speed. He had been temperamental from the start, and despite Daniel's best efforts, the horse had never fully trusted anyone. Today, however, the animal was in full rage, charging through the paddock, kicking up dust with every step. "Stay back!" Daniel shouted as the workers scattered. But Elena, curious and unable to look away, stepped closer. Her eyes locked onto Centauro, and for a moment, it was as though she could see into his soul. She didn't understand why, but something told her the horse wasn't just angry, it was in pain. Suddenly, Centauro turned and charged directly at her. Panic surged in Daniel's chest. He had to act fast. "Elena, get out of the way," he yelled, his voice filled with urgency. But it was too late. Elena froze, her body stiff with fear as the massive stallion charged toward her, its hooves pounding the ground like thunder. In that moment time seemed to slow. Elena's feet remained planted firmly in place as Santoro barreled toward her, his eyes wild and filled with terror. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted toward her, his every muscle screaming for him to move faster. He could see the fear in her eyes and it paralyzed him with urgency. "Elena!" he shouted, his voice cracking through the air. He reached out, his hand desperate to grab her arm, but it was as if she couldn't hear him. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Daniel knew he had only seconds to make a choice. He could try to reach Elena, but if he did, there was a good chance he wouldn't make it in time. Or he could risk it all, leap in front of the horse and hope that his connection with the animal would be enough to stop the impending disaster. Without a second thought, Daniel made his decision. He lunged forward, throwing his body between Elena and the charging stallion. The air was thick with dust and the smell of sweat and fear. His hands shook as he extended them out, palms open, trying to communicate with the horse through nothing but instinct. "Santoro, stop!" Daniel shouted, his voice firm but calm. The stallion's wild eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, it felt as if the world had come to a complete stop. The horse hesitated, its muscles tensing as it fought against the primal urge to continue its charge. Daniel kept his gaze steady, willing the horse to understand. "Easy boy," he murmured. "I'm here. It's okay." The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, in a sudden, almost miraculous moment, Santoro's pace began to slow. The beast's heavy breathing filled the air as the stallion came to a skidding stop just inches away from Daniel. Elena stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief as she watched the scene unfold before her. The tension in the air was palpable, the quiet aftermath almost more deafening than the chaos that had just ensued. Daniel exhaled, his heart racing as he slowly lowered his hands, his body still tense from the adrenaline. His gaze met Elena's and for a brief moment their eyes locked. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice softer now, though the weight of the moment lingered. Elena stood frozen, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she processed what had just happened. She nodded, but her expression was a mixture of awe and confusion. I didn't know," Elena began, her voice trembling, but she couldn't finish the sentence. What could she say? How could she possibly understand what had just transpired? Daniel turned his attention back to Santoro, who was now breathing heavily, his muscles still twitching from the rush of fear. "Easy boy," Daniel whispered, reaching out to calm the animal. He stroked Santoro's neck gently, easing the tension that still clung to the stallion's body. The ranch fell into an eerie silence after the chaos had subsided. The workers, who had scattered in fear moments before, slowly began to approach again, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had all witnessed the near disaster, but now they stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline. He reached for a towel and wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to calm his racing heart. The sound of Santoro's breathing steadied as the stallion began to relax, its fear slowly giving way to trust. Elena, however, didn't move. She was still standing there, staring at Daniel as though she couldn't quite grasp what had just happened. Her mind raced with questions, emotions colliding in a swirl of confusion and gratitude. The fact that Daniel had placed himself between her and the horse, risking his own life, was a shock to her. For the first time she saw him not just as a worker on her father's ranch, but as someone with depth, someone who carried quiet courage. You saved me," Elena said softly, her voice shaky as she finally found her words. Daniel glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond at first, as though the weight of her words was still settling on him. Instead, he turned back to Santoro, gently patting the horse's neck to calm him further. "It's nothing," Daniel replied finally, his voice humble, though there was a hint of weariness in it. "The horse, he's not really a danger unless someone provokes him." Elena stepped closer, her eyes still wide. "But you didn't just stop him. You understood him. You saved me." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't save you. I know him. Horses aren't dangerous unless you don't listen to them. They feel what we feel. If you're calm with them, they'll respond. But if you show fear, they react to it." Elena looked at him, her gaze softening. "I didn't know," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. "I didn't know you could do that." Daniel felt his heart race again, but this time it wasn't from fear. The way Elena looked at him, like she saw him for the first time, was enough to make him feel exposed, vulnerable. But he couldn't let his guard down, not with her. I've spent my whole life with horses, Daniel said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. They don't need to be tamed by force. Just understanding. Elena was silent for a moment, her gaze not leaving his. Then she took a hesitant step forward. Thank you, she said again, her voice softer, tinged with something Daniel couldn't quite place. Daniel nodded, stepping back from Centauro as the horse began to settle. He wanted to say something but the words wouldn't come. There was something in the way Elena was looking at him now, something different, and it made him feel as though his world had shifted without warning. But he couldn't let himself get caught up in this. He had a job to do, and Elena was still his employer's daughter. Their worlds were different. His life was here on this ranch, working with horses, while hers was filled with luxury and expectations. With a quick glance at the ground, Daniel cleared his throat. I should get back to work, he said, his voice firm again. The horses won't take care of themselves. Elena nodded, though she didn't look away. There was something in her eyes now that Daniel couldn't ignore, but he couldn't afford to think about it. As he turned away, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of loss, like something important had just passed between them. The next few days were filled with an uncomfortable tension, as though the ranch itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Daniel kept to his work as he always did, focusing on the horses and the land, but his thoughts often wandered back to Elena. Every time their paths crossed, a silence hung between them, heavy, filled with unspoken words, with emotions neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Elena, on the other hand, found it increasingly difficult to return to her old routine. The wealth, the social gatherings, the life her father expected her to live, all of it felt so distant now, so hollow. She spent more and more time in the stables, watching Daniel with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. His quiet strength, his easy confidence with the horses, was a stark contrast to the men she had known in her life. He didn't try to impress anyone. He simply existed, and in that simplicity, there was something that drew her in. She began to wonder if the life she had been living was the one she truly wanted. Daniel, in his humble yet powerful way, had opened her eyes to the possibility of something else, something freer. But that freedom came with its own set of challenges she wasn't sure she was ready to face. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the ranch, Elena found herself walking toward the stables once again. It had become a habit now, one she didn't question. The air smelled of hay and fresh earth, and the sounds of the horses shifting in their stalls brought her a strange sense of peace. She entered quietly, her footsteps soft on the dirt floor. Daniel was there as always, tending to the horses. His movements were fluid and practiced, but tonight there was something different in the way he moved. The tension in his posture was unmistakable. Elena, Daniel said without turning around, his voice more tense than usual. Elena stopped in her tracks, unsure of what to say. The silence between them was thick, as if both of them were waiting for the other to speak first. Finally she found her voice. Why do you do it? She asked, her words coming out before she had fully thought them through. Why do you stay here working with horses when you could have so much more? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he continued his work, his hands moving carefully as he adjusted the saddle on a horse. Elena watched him, waiting for an answer. She had asked the question out of curiosity, but now that it hung in the air, she realized it was more than just curiosity. She wanted to understand him. She wanted to understand why someone like him, someone with so much to offer, would choose a life of simplicity and hard work. He finally spoke, his voice low and calm. This is what I know. It's not about having more, it's about understanding what you have. The horses, the land, the work, it's all part of something bigger. It's about respect. Respect for what's given to you and what you give back. Elena felt a lump rise in her throat at his words. There was a depth to him, a wisdom that she hadn't fully understood until now. He wasn't just a worker on her father's ranch. He was someone who had lived a life of quiet resilience, someone who had chosen his path not because it was easy, but because it was true to who he was. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice almost lost in the stillness of the stable. How do you know what's right? How do you know what to choose? Daniel turned then, finally meeting her gaze. There was something raw in his eyes, a kind of vulnerability that she hadn't expected. You'll know when it's time. You'll feel it. Elena's heart raced, her breath catching in her chest. His words resonated deep within her, but she couldn't quite grasp the meaning. What was it that was holding her back? Why was she so afraid to let go of the life her father had given her? And more importantly, why was she so drawn to Daniel? The days that followed were filled with a growing tension. Elena could feel the change in herself, a shift that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Every time she passed Daniel in the stables, she felt a pull toward him, something she couldn't deny, but something she also couldn't fully understand. She wanted to speak to him more, wanted to learn more about the life he led, but every time she tried, her father's voice echoed in her mind. "You are not like them, Elena." Her father's words had always been clear. She was a pharaoh, and that meant something. It meant wealth, it meant power, and it meant a life of luxury and control. But lately, those words had begun to feel empty, hollow, as if they were chains rather than guiding principles. One afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the horizon, Elena made a decision. She couldn't live this way anymore, not with the constant weight of her father's expectations, not with the quiet ache in her chest every time she saw Daniel. She had to confront the truth no matter how painful it might be. She found her father in his office, sitting behind his large desk, papers scattered around him. The harsh light from the lamp illuminated his stern face, casting long shadows in the room. When he saw Elena standing in the doorway, his expression hardened. "What is it?" he asked, his voice clipped. "You should be at the dinner table by now. The guests are waiting." Elena took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. She couldn't keep living this lie. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. "I'm not going to the dinner," she said, her voice steady though her heart raced. "I don't want to live this life anymore." Don Esteban's eyes narrowed as he set his pen down slowly. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice low, his anger barely contained. "I mean that I don't want to be controlled by you anymore," Elena continued, taking a step forward. "I don't want to marry someone for the sake of appearances. I don't want to live in a world where my every move is planned for me. I want to make my own choices." Don Esteban stood up, his face turning red with fury. "You are a pharaoh," he snapped, his voice shaking with rage. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? Do you have any idea what you're throwing away?" Elena stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm not going to let you control my life anymore, father. I can't keep pretending. Not when I know there's something else out there. Something real." Her words hit him like a slap, and for a moment they both stood in silence. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't back down. She couldn't. "You don't know what you're talking about," Don Esteban growled, his eyes flashing with a mix of hurt and fury. "You'll ruin everything, Elena. Everything I've built for you, for this family. You'll be nothing without me, without my name." Elena shook her head. "I'd rather be nothing than live this way." Her father's face twisted in anger. "You are a fool," he spat. "A naive, foolish girl who doesn't understand the consequences of her actions. I've given you everything, and this is how you repay me." Elena stepped back, her chest tightening with emotion. "I'm not repaying you, father. I'm finally living for myself." Don Esteban moved toward her, his steps heavy with authority. "You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it," he hissed. Elena didn't flinch. She had made her decision. As she walked out of the room, her heart raced with a mixture of fear and relief. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if she would lose everything, or if her father would somehow make her life even harder than it had already been. But one thing was certain, she could never go back to the way things were. The days after Elena's confrontation with her father were fraught with tension. She had not returned to the lavish dinner her father had expected her to attend, and instead she spent her time in the stables, her sanctuary, where she found solace in the quiet companionship of the horses. Each visit there seemed to draw her closer to the world Daniel had introduced her to, the world of simplicity, honesty, and patience. But the silence at home was heavy. Don Esteban had not spoken to her directly since their argument. His presence in the house was oppressive, and every time Elena passed him in the hall or caught sight of him at dinner, she could feel the walls closing in. She knew he was planning his next move, and the thought of it made her anxious. One evening, as she wandered the ranch aimlessly, trying to escape the suffocating tension in the house, Elena found herself drawn to the stables once again. As she entered, she spotted Daniel in the far corner, brushing down one of the horses. The soft sound of his movements, the rhythmic brushing, was calming, and for a moment, Elena allowed herself to forget everything. When Daniel looked up and saw her, his face softened, though there was a hint of worry in his eyes. "You should be careful," he said quietly, wiping his hands on his pants. "Your father won't be pleased you're here. Not after everything that happened." Elena hesitated, looking down at the dirt beneath her feet. "I don't care about what he thinks anymore," she said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. "I've made my choice." Daniel didn't speak right away. Instead, he moved closer, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of concern and something else, something unspoken. What's going to happen now? He asked, his voice low. You know your father won't let this go. He'll make things difficult for you. Elena looked up at him, her heart heavy with uncertainty. I don't know, she admitted. I've tried to live my life for him, for everyone else. But I can't anymore. I can't keep pretending. Daniel nodded, his expression understanding. There was a long pause, and for a brief moment, they both stood in silence as if waiting for something to change. You know, Elena began softly, I never realized how much I was trapped. I thought I had everything, but all I had was a life filled with rules and expectations. I never felt free until now, until I came here and you showed me a different way. Daniel's expression softened, and for a moment their eyes locked. It's not always easy, he said, his voice quiet. Freedom comes with its own burdens. You have to be willing to stand up for yourself, no matter what the consequences are. Elena nodded, a sense of resolve slowly building inside her. I know, she said, her voice firmer now. I've made my choice, Daniel. I'm not going back. Just as she spoke, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle broke the moment. Elena's heart sank as she recognized the sleek black car. It was her father's. She didn't need to turn around to know he was coming for her. I have to go, she said quickly, her voice filled with urgency. I don't want him to see me here. Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. You have to be ready, Elena. This isn't going to be easy. She nodded, her heart racing as she turned to leave. But before she could take another step, Daniel called out to her. Elena, he said softly, and she turned back to face him. I'm here, he said, his voice steady, filled with quiet strength. If you need me, I'll be here. Elena smiled, though the tears in her eyes threatened to break free. Thank you, she whispered before walking quickly toward the house, her heart a mixture of fear and hope. Elena didn't know what to expect when she returned to the house that evening. The oppressive silence between her and her father seemed thicker now, and she could feel the weight of his expectations pressing down on her every step. The grand estate that had once felt like her home now seemed cold and unfamiliar, as if it no longer held any warmth for her. As she entered the house, her father was sitting in his study, the dim light from his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His stern gaze met hers as she walked in, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, a silent standoff that neither seemed ready to break. Sit down, Don Esteban finally said, his voice cold and authoritative. We need to talk. Elena stood frozen for a moment before reluctantly pulling out the chair across from him. She sat down slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but she wasn't sure how much longer she could endure the confrontation. You've made a grave mistake, Elena, her father began, his voice sharp, yet tinged with disappointment. You think you can just walk away from everything I've built for you. For us. The life you want is a fantasy. It's not real. Elena clenched her fists under the table, trying to steady her breathing. It is real, father. And I'm done pretending. I don't want the life you've planned for me anymore. I want to make my own choices, live my own way. Her father's face twisted in anger. You're a fool, he spat. You don't understand the consequences of your actions. You'll ruin everything. You'll be nothing without my name, without my wealth. I've given you everything, Elena. And you're throwing it all away for a man who is beneath you. The words stung, but Elena refused to let them break her. She had made her decision, and nothing he could say would change that. I'm not throwing it all away, she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. I'm choosing something that matters. Something real. Her father stood abruptly, slamming his fist down on the desk. You don't know what real is. You're just a child playing at something you don't understand. I've given you everything you could ever want, and this is how you repay me. Elena stood up, her legs shaking but her resolve strong. I don't want everything you've given me, father. I want to be free. I want to live a life where I'm not controlled by your expectations, by your rules. I want to live for myself. There was a long silence between them, the anger in her father's eyes slowly being replaced by a flicker of something darker. Something dangerous. Elena could feel it, he wasn't just angry. He was hurt. And that hurt had turned into something much more dangerous. I'll make sure you regret this, Don Esteban growled, his voice low and menacing. You'll come crawling back to me, Elena? And when you do, I won't be here to save you. Elena didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already made up her mind, and no matter what her father threatened, she wouldn't go back to the life he had planned for her. As she turned to leave the study, her father's voice followed her, cold and final. You'll be nothing without me, Elena? Nothing. The weight of his words pressed down on her as she walked out of the room, But this time she didn't flinch. She had made her choice. And no matter how hard it would be, she was ready to face the consequences. The next morning the world felt different for Elena. The sun rose as it always did, casting a golden light over the ranch, but the air seemed thicker somehow, laden with the tension of everything that had happened. Her father's words echoed in her mind, but she refused to let them consume her. She had made her choice and now there was no going back. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. She couldn't be under the same roof as her father, knowing that he would never understand, never accept her decision. She had to leave. She had to find something more for herself, something real. Elena packed a small bag with a few essentials, clothes, a bit of money she had saved from her allowance, and a letter for her father. The letter was short, but it was the only way she could think of to explain. She couldn't stay and face him again, not now. Before she left the house, she went to the stables one last time. The horses, the ranch, had become her refuge, her sanctuary. She stood in front of Centaur's stall, the powerful stallion who had taught her more about strength and patience than anyone else in her life. The horse watched her, his dark eyes calm yet filled with an understanding she couldn't quite grasp. "Goodbye," Elena whispered softly to him. "I don't know what comes next, but I can't stay here anymore." She turned to leave, but the sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. Leaving so soon? Daniel's voice, low and steady, reached her before she could move. She turned, startled to see him standing just inside the stable door, his expression unreadable. "I have to," she said quietly, her heart aching. "I can't stay with him anymore. Not after everything." Daniel didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, his gaze soft but intense. Then he took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet concern. "Once you leave, there's no going back. Your father won't make it easy for you." Elena nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I know. But I can't live like this. Not anymore." Daniel's gaze softened, and he reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Then you're stronger than you think, Elena?" She looked up at him, her heart pounding. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. Yet, in this moment, standing before him, she also felt the weight of her decision slowly lifting. She wasn't alone in this, not really. Daniel was here and he wasn't judging her. He understood. "I don't know where this will take me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can't keep living a life that's not mine." Daniel gave a small, understanding nod. "I get it. You've made your choice and that's all that matters now." Elena swallowed hard, the tears threatening to spill over, but she held them back. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "For everything." Daniel smiled softly, his eyes kind. "You don't have to thank me, Elena. You're the one who has the strength to make it happen. Just remember you're not alone." For the first time in days, Elena felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had made her decision, and while it was scary, while it meant leaving everything she had known, it was the only choice she could make. As she turned to walk away, Daniel called after her. "Elena." She paused and looked back at him, her heart skipping a beat. "Yes. If you need anything," he said, his voice steady and reassuring, "I'm here. Always." The words were simple, but they were everything she needed to hear. For the first time, Elena felt a sense of hope. Real hope, not the kind that came from promises or expectations, but hope that came from within herself. With a final nod, she turned and walked out of the stable, ready to face whatever came next. Elena walked away from the ranch, her steps light yet filled with purpose. She had no clear destination in mind, only the need to be free, to escape the world her father had built for her. Every step she took away from the house felt like a step closer to herself, to a life that was truly hers. The world outside the gates of her father's estate felt vast and unfamiliar. The road stretched out in front of her, winding through fields and small towns she had only heard about in passing. She had spent most of her life sheltered within the confines of the ranch, but now, for the first time, she felt the weight of the world in its entirety. There was fear in that weight, but there was also freedom. A freedom that she hadn't realized she craved so desperately until now. Elena's mind kept drifting back to Daniel. His words echoed in her head, his calm, steady presence something she could almost feel with her entire being. It wasn't just his actions that had drawn her to him, it was the way he lived his life with quiet dignity, never needing the approval of anyone else. She thought about how he had stood in front of Centauro, placing himself between her and the horse without hesitation. He had saved her, yes, but it wasn't just his bravery that had moved her, it was his quiet strength, his ability to remain calm in the face of danger. Daniel had a way of seeing the world differently, a way that made her question everything she had been taught. He understood the animals, the land, and in a way he understood her too. She hadn't expected to feel so drawn to him, but now she couldn't ignore it. What they shared was unspoken, a bond that had formed in the midst of chaos, in the moments when their worlds collided. And yet, as much as she wanted to go to him to tell him how she felt, Elena knew that her journey wasn't just about him, it was about her. She needed to find her own path first, to build her own life, separate from her father's control. The future wasn't clear, but for the first time in her life she felt like she had a choice. She was no longer bound by the expectations of her past. She could choose what came next. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the fields, Elena found a small bench by the side of the road and sat down, letting out a deep breath. For the first time she allowed herself to think about what was next, not with fear but with possibility. She had so many questions, so many uncertainties, but she knew one thing for sure, she wasn't alone in this. Daniel's words still rang in her mind, "You're not alone." The wind whispered through the trees, and Elena closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds of the world around her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that whatever came next she would face it on her own terms. And maybe, just maybe, that was all she needed. In the distance she thought she saw a shadow approaching, but it was too far to make out clearly. It didn't matter. She didn't need to know who or what it was. What mattered was that she had made her choice. She had chosen freedom. And that was enough for now. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elena felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. Whatever came next she would be ready.